Good morning. Is everyone here? Good. Hello. Hello all. Hope you're well. Nice to see you. Good morning to you all. Let's get started. And then, since I'm hearing you, at least in the chat room, and presumably you're both hearing and seeing me, we are recording the session for future use. So good morning again. And if you have two questions regarding the essay, Sarah, then I will stay for a few minutes after class. We finish at 12:15, and you can ask me your questions then, okay, if you can stay. Otherwise, email me, and I'll respond that way. I may be able to give you slightly better response verbally, though, so stick around after class, and I'll spend a few minutes with you for those of you who have questions, all right? So meanwhile, our goal today is to finish our treatment of Aristotle's Ethics of the Golden Mean, which we made considerable progress with on Monday in the plenary. So I would like to know, first of all, if any of you have any questions about any of the material that we covered on Monday. If so, please feel free to type them into the chat room or express them verbally. Any questions about what we did on Monday? Not yet. Okay, that's fine. And if they do arise in the process of today's class, if you think of a question or you remember a question you wanted to ask and you didn't get a chance to, please go ahead. I just want to clarify a couple of things with you to sort of summarize and sharpen a little bit what we discussed on Monday. And then I'm going to illustrate something quite important about Aristotle's the origins of his Ethics of the Golden Mean. As I mentioned to you, I'm going to show you some slides that will help to illustrate the importance of geometry, not only for Aristotle, but for his teacher Plato, and also the relevance of geometry both to ethics and to aesthetics, which in the latter case is a bit more obvious to us. But I want to get you thinking about this. I think you will be very interested, perhaps some of you certainly will be interested in what I'm going to depict about the relation of geometry to both ethics and aesthetics. So that's coming up in a few minutes today. But before we get there, before we go to the slideshow, I do want to make a couple of points about what we covered in the Nicomachean Ethics. And firstly, is that we use the word happiness, right? I mean, in the translation that you have in your texts and in almost all translations, then Aristotle is, remember, upholding the idea that the thing that everybody wants for its own sake and not for the sake of something else is happiness, right? In other words, the thing that has what he called inherent value or intrinsic value because we desire it for itself rather than for the sake of something else is happiness, right? You remember that. We talked about that quite a bit, and we took some time to carefully draw a distinction between things that have inherent value or intrinsic value, things that are valuable for themselves and not for the sake of other things, and in contrast with instrumental value, things which are useful as means to other ends, but things that in and of themselves don't necessarily have inherent value, but they do have instrumental value. So basically, that's the difference. And what was significant in Aristotle's Ethics is that what's really valuable for us in life is that which has inherent value. Things that we value in and of themselves are going to be the things that have lasting value for us. And happiness is chief among those. And then, as we saw with Aristotle, the recipe, if you like, or the methodology for achieving that kind of happiness is going to be an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. I just want to say something about this word happiness, because for some people, and certainly in English, it's not really as good a word as he uses in Greek. And the word that he uses in Greek to describe happiness doesn't translate exactly as happiness. although I think everyone understands it in the way that Aristotle intended it. I just want to say something about the word that he uses that we've kind of absorbed into English, but we don't use in common speech. So it's called eudaimonia. I'll type it into the chat room. Presumably you can all see it. Okay, now that's a Greek word. It's not a disease. Eudaimonia, not mania. I have a typo there. Wait a second. That's the word. Sorry about the typo. Eudaimonia. Okay, not eudaimania. Eudaimonia. And that word is what is translated as happiness into English, but it means more than that. Just in case we think about happiness as a transitory mood, you know, a kind of like a euphoria that comes and goes. Some of you may think of happiness as that, something that doesn't last very long. It's good to be happy, but then we get unhappy in the next moment. That's not what Aristotle means. Eudaimonia means something more than that. You can think of it as a kind of lasting happiness. Okay, I'll enter that as well. So it's more than a mood. It's really an attainment. Lasting happiness. Another synonym for that might be the idea of fulfillment. I like the word fulfillment because it's something that can't be taken from you. If you have done something fulfilling, then you remain fulfilled by it. So it also has that connotation of enduring or lasting. Yes, and there's another kind of thing you could think about, which is another way in which this is expressed sometimes is flourishing. Right? The idea of human flourishing. Eudaimonia means human flourishing, or personal flourishing, but also it's a kind of flourishing that applies to groups of people too. And again, the Greek idea would be if you have enough people flourishing, then society itself will flourish. So there's that sense of a protractedness in time. Does everybody get this? That's important. So it's not the kind of happiness that one attains or develops. Inner peace, yes. That's another way, Abraham, you could say inner peace. But peace often, at least to the Greeks, might imply, remember, if peace is a virtue, then too much of it is also not good, right? Because too much peace would be a kind of paralysis, you know. And I don't think peace is a virtue. Peace is not a virtue because you couldn't have too much of it either. Perhaps that's not a virtue. But in the sense of inner peace, yes, you could say that, but in a lasting way, right? And I think in the sense of lasting inner peace, yes, you could substitute that as a synonym too. I'm agreeing with you. Okay, so think about it as not a mood, not a transient mood, but rather as a state of the mind and of the heart, which is a much more enduring, a much more perduring state that's not easily destroyed or undermined by anything else that goes on. And the practice of virtue therefore strengthens not only our attainment of happiness, but also strengthens our ability to sustain happiness, or if you like, inner peace or flourishing, all of those things. Okay, is that a bit of a clarification? Is that helpful? Is that helpful to you? I hope it's helpful to you. It's the intention to provide a better explanation. Eudaimonia is the Greek word. And conversely, people who practice vices instead of virtues will become unhappy. I mean, it follows if you allow yourself to err on either extreme, because these are habits. Remember, that's the second important point, right? For Aristotle, we're not born virtuous or vicious. We're simply born as creatures of habit. We are going to acquire habits no matter what. And so then the big question is, well, what kind of habits are we going to acquire, right? That's the big issue. And if we acquire virtuous habits, that will definitely tend toward making us happy in this eudaimonic sense. Excuse me. Whereas if we acquire vicious habits, that will conduce to our unhappiness. And if you think about this in ordinary life, in everyday life, surely from your experience, you might be able to confirm that it's very rare to find a vicious person who's happy, right? Remember, if people who practice vice And this is the broader meaning. We think of vicious, again, in a different meaning in English, vicious. We think of vicious like a dog that's vicious is a dog that will tend to want to bite us, right? But we talk about vicious people. We usually mean people who are mean, violent, dangerous, vicious, right? But in broadly speaking, vicious doesn't simply mean violently dangerous. Vicious means as applied to a person, someone who has practiced or acquired the habit of vice. So that's the adjective that comes from vice, right? It comes from the root word of vicious is vice. And Aristotle would say that a vicious person is therefore someone who's acquired habits of vice. That's a broader meaning than we usually use in everyday English. But happiness also is a broader meaning, okay? I just want to make sure you understand this. So whether it's the vice of excess or the vice of deficiency, people who overindulge or underindulge may run the risk, therefore, of becoming vicious. And the point I'm making is that you will not find too many people who are both vicious and happy, if you think about it. People who are vicious are not happy, whether they're vicious toward themselves or vicious toward others. Vice does not make us happy, whereas virtue does. That's Aristotle's point. Okay. So are we clear about those things? Okay, very good. And so one of the things you might consider as interesting, good, I'm glad for the S's, that's fine. One of the things that's interesting about Aristotle is that he's not prejudging people. He's not saying we're born good or bad. He's not saying we're born saints or sinners. He's not saying we're born to be criminals or law-abiding citizens. He's saying it depends on what kind of habits we acquire. And so this is a very neutral view. He's not judging anybody, and he's not judging human nature, or rather prejudging it. That's really important, right? He's saying, look, we're creatures of habit. So obviously, and it goes without saying, if we're creatures of habit, then the kind of people we grow up into being, the kind of citizens we become, because with Aristotle, there's always a political dimension to this, the kind of society we inhabit is going to depend on what kinds of habits we acquire from our earliest time. And so we're going to be really dependent when we're young on perhaps our parents, our family, our friends, our teachers, and our general ethos in society, the kind of environment we're in, to inform our habits, and hopefully that'll be good. But we can still change them. He's not condemning anybody either. This virtue ethics is not ever saying that someone is beyond recuperation. They may have developed very, very bad habits, but even so, if they're willing to make an effort, Aristotle would assert it's certainly possible for us to change bad habits into good ones with the effort. There's nothing written in our genes, that says we're bad. It's a question of our habits. But of course, the reverse is also true. That if we get too complacent or allow ourselves to get sloppy or careless and to start acquiring bad habits, we could certainly go from a state of virtue into a state of one of the two vices, right? So it goes both ways. It's all reversible. So we should therefore be, in a certain sense, vigilant in the maintenance of our virtues. But the more habitual we are about it, the easier it is. It becomes a routine precisely because we are creatures of habit, okay? That's one thing. And applied to society overall, I think it's important here, just I'm telling you in passing, it's Aristotle who also said that humans are political animals. This is from his Politics. Not only are we creatures of habit, but we're political animals, and therefore everything that the human being does sooner or later is going to involve politics or get politicized or be caught up in political process. So especially in an election year, everything gets politicized, right? Everything. We're political animals. Aristotle, if you could look on our contemporary America today, he'd say, well, yeah, we're political animals. It figures, it's exactly what he thought we were. And that's not always a bad thing either, to be a political animal. But he also said, I'll just say this in passing, it's hooked in with his economic theory. And this may interest you, that he said very long ago in his economics text that a society with a strong middle class is going to be the most pleasant to live in, and also the most pleasant to govern. So the middle way, in terms of his ethics, the golden mean, in terms of his ethics and finding that intermediate path between excess and deficiency, also has political, social, and economic implications. Because if you consider what a strong middle class means, right, it means a kind of normal distribution of wealth so that you don't have too many people who are controlling all the resources, and you don't have too many people who are basically controlling zero resources. In other words, you don't have this polarization of wealth where you have excess wealth among the elites and excess poverty among the have-nots. If you have a strong middle class, then those vices, which Aristotle would call them, are economic vices, right? The extremes, too much or not enough. He'd say it's great to have a state where most people are in the middle class, so there's a medium golden mean of virtue there in people having what they need, and beyond that having a few luxuries and having a good life, which is what the Greeks wanted and what they sought. But he would say definitely that if we have a society, or anybody has a society, in which there's economic polarization, then you're going to end up with that vicious imbalance where very few people are going to have control of most of the wealth, and a lot of people, potentially a lot more people, are going to fall through the cracks, therefore, and have proportionately or disproportionately very little to fall back on. And that, he says, will be a recipe for political problems, which I think is obvious to us. So therefore, a strong middle class is absolutely imperative to a stable and a relatively happy state. Okay, and I'm not preaching politics to you. I'm just saying this is a fallout. This is a corollary of his ethics, right? Because remember, for the Greeks, ethics is going to be vitally important. Plato's Academy, in which Aristotle learned for so many years, was the place where the rulers were trained. I mean, this was a place where people who were going to assume responsibility and governance and leadership were supposed to be trained. That's why Plato founded the Academy, partly why he founded it. And so they were all going to learn about geometry and proportion and ethics and aesthetics as part of the formation of their very suitability to be political leaders. In the Greek mind, this was all tied together, and it's something that I think we could benefit, and I think our society could certainly benefit from taking into account. Okay, so is that clear? I hope in some way helpful or insightful to give you a slightly bigger picture of what Aristotle is trying to accomplish. Okay? All right, that's yes. All right, very good. I'm glad you're with it this morning. We're all on the same page. Okay, so we get that conception, and then at the same time, remember there are exceptions to every rule. And for Aristotle, what are the exceptions? What are some of the things that are never considered to be virtuous, no matter whether they're practiced in moderation or not? Remember, what are some of the counterexamples? He says not everything is a virtue just because it's practiced in moderation. Does anyone remember? I want to type in what are some of the things that would be not virtuous? Anyone remember? Nobody remembers? If Aristotle is saying that virtue lies in moderation, that in other words, on two sides of every virtue, there's a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. You do remember this, right? Some of you, hopefully, we're here on Monday. A virtue's in the middle, and that if you have not enough of something, that vice of deficiency, and too much of something. And if you eat too much or eat too little, it's going to make you sick over a period of time. And if you eat the right amount, that's a virtue in terms of your diet, not in terms of your ethics, right? That's a medical virtue. If you exercise a moderate amount, what's right for you, then of course that will be a virtue in terms of your health, not ethically, but in terms of your health. And not enough exercise is therefore going to be bad for you, and too much exercise, even if you're an athlete, you'll get injured or you burn yourself out, so too much is also not good. But finding the virtue amount relative to each of us is absolutely vital, not only in ethics but also in health. But some examples, I'm surprised that nobody remembers some of the examples. Remember, the four cardinal virtues to the Greeks were courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance. Temperance itself means moderation. So that's all. We looked at some of the examples of courage being a virtue. Therefore, we would speak of insufficient courage as being cowardice, which we're normally accustomed to thinking of, but we don't often think of the excess. There's another vice on the other side. Remember? Recklessness, right? Someone who has too much courage, that becomes a vice. If you fear nothing, then you're actually dangerous to yourself and others, as in reckless driving, people who don't take any consequences into account, right? Because they're reckless. Prudence, yes, prudence is very good. But that's not an extreme nivrizi. Prudence means, in a salutary sense, it means care of the self, okay? It means looking out for your better interests, right? So prudence is also a virtue, and recklessness, in that sense, would also be an extreme, okay? And of course, we could say not enough prudence, not enough care of the self would be some kind of a different form of abuse. But that's not one of the cardinal virtues. We're back to the cardinal virtues, and we talked about last day not only courage as a virtue and what its extremes were, but also we talked about justice and its possible interpretations. Not enough and too much. Not enough justice would possibly be anarchy. Too much justice would be police state or totalitarian state. We talked about wisdom. Not enough is folly. Generally, we talk about foolishness, and too much wisdom would be arrogance, right, or condensation, and being basically condescending to others, or haughtiness, and so forth. Now, this brings up an interesting point. I mean, we'll go to the counter examples and then an interesting point. Counter examples to this. None of you have yet come up with them, so I'm going to just go back to the text. I'm not going to share it with you because it's in your book, but I'll just read it to you. Aristotle says, not every action nor every passion admits of a mean, meaning a golden mean or a virtue. For some have names that already imply badness. For example, shamelessness, envy, and in the cases of actions, adultery, theft, and murder. So these things could never be virtuous. You can't say, I commit just the right of adultery, so I'm a virtuous adulterer because I don't do too little, I don't do too much, or I'm a virtuous murderer because I don't kill too many people, I don't too few, just enough. That Aristotle says that's impossible to justify on this scheme, because those actions themselves are always bad, so that you could never consider them to be virtues, okay, regardless of which proportion they're done in. So is that clear that there are exceptions to this? You can't say anything is a virtue if you do it in moderation. There are going to be obvious exceptions, and Aristotle gives them. That's very important. So you can't justify everything by this, just things that are supposedly virtuous. Okay, before we go to the slides, I want to make one more point that I made in passing on Monday, but I want to spend a little time now elaborating for you. Do you remember at the beginning, I don't know how many of you were there on Monday, but I'm assuming if you weren't, you have by now watched the video. It's very important that you do this, because every week, as you've by now hopefully realized, that the two lectures are successive, and our Thursday lecture just with my group, Section M, the supposedly 80 of you, half of whom are now present, the 80 of you in Section M are going to, on Thursdays, participate in a continuation of the plenary lecture that I give on Mondays. So you know this, I'm sure, by now. It's important for you either to be there or to view it at your convenience. All right, just a reminder. And one of the things I said during the overview to ethics was that no system of ethics is perfect. Every system of ethics that we're going to look at in the next 5 weeks has both strengths and weaknesses. You remember that? I said that at the beginning. I gave you a little slideshow of overviews, and we looked at basic ethics and descriptive and normative and applied ethics and all of that. But I said that every system has strengths and weaknesses. I don't know if you remember that, but that's why I'm repeating it now. It's important. If there were one perfect system of ethics, we'd probably all be adopting it. The very fact that every system has strengths and weaknesses is partly why there are so many different systems of ethics in the world, because we'll all have different preferences about what we're willing to laud or praise as the strengths of a given system, and we'll all have arguably different tastes and preferences and weaknesses, what we're willing to excuse, right? What we're willing to say, okay, well, I know that's a weakness, but I'll live with it, right? So every system is like that. And virtue ethics has, as you can see, some of the strengths, that it's not judgmental about people. It doesn't prejudge us as good or bad. It presumes we could all be good and happy, therefore, if we practice virtues. It's assuming that most people could do this. And so there's a lot of positive to be said about it. Does anybody have any idea what one of the criticisms that could be levied? What might one object to? Does anybody have any idea of what one of the weaknesses of virtue ethics might be? I'm going to point out one. There's one really big potential glaring weakness in virtue ethics, which I'll point out now if no one has any wild guesses this morning or otherwise knows. Shall I tell you? Okay. It's this, and maybe you'll think of some others, but here's the real problem, as I see it, that what we do not have is any kind of universal accord on what the virtues are. Even if we all agree that Aristotle is brilliant in this schema and that we really like Aristotle's way of showing us that every virtue has, two vices, one of deficiency and one of excess, what we don't have is universal agreement on exactly what the virtues are. Is this clear? And I'm going to give you some concrete examples. Mame, I'm not sure what you mean by misguidance, but the thing is that different cultures and different religions may well uphold different virtues or different practices as virtuous. And so and sometimes contradictory ones. So for example, let us say that we take pride. I'm typing it in. Okay? Now, in Greek, in the time of Aristotle, and certainly in secular society, it's perfectly fine, and in fact, it's almost obligatory for you to take pride in what you do. If you do something well, you should take pride in it. Have you been told this? Have you heard this? Are you yourselves willing to take pride? I mean, I think so. We all are brought up, or most of us are brought up, many of you were saying yes, that there's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, there's something right with taking pride in what you do. If you do something well, if you do your work well, then definitely that's a source of pride, and you're entitled to take some pride in it. And we want that to be the case. So then pride is a virtue, okay? So then if pride is a virtue, and it was to Aristotle, definitely, the Greeks had what they took a healthy pride. If you were a shipbuilder and you built great ships, you would take pride in building great ships. If you're a musician and you play beautiful music, then you would take some pride in it. Yes, and the Greeks would say that's absolutely fine. So if it's a virtue, what would the vices look like? What would we call a deficiency of pride? What might that be called? Someone who does not have enough pride in what they do. Any ideas? Because if it's a virtue, and it was for Aristotle, then there must be two vices, right? Insecurity, yes. Humility, well, humility would be a kind of a false humility in this case, right? But that's right, Mame. Humility would be insufficient pride. Insecurity would be definitely a way of expressing insufficient pride in oneself, right? One could say low psychologically, maybe low self-esteem, right? Would that be another one? All right. Psychologically speaking, people who have low self-esteem means they don't have enough pride, right? They don't esteem themselves. They don't value themselves. So that would be, all those things would be examples of the vice of insufficient pride. What about too much pride? So what if you took too much pride in yourself or what you did? What would that look like? What would be some words for that? Arrogance, definitely, Mame. Arrogance, right? Exactly right. Any other thoughts? What other kinds of labels might we attach to someone who's suffering from what Aristotle would call an excess of pride? Arrogance is definitely one. Ego, yes, egotistical. That's right, Emily. Someone who's egotistical, exactly. That's beyond proud, right? That's bragging. Yes, don't worry about it. I can read your, because I'm a bad typist, so I can, I can read typos, no problem. Yeah, egotism, cocky. That's right. Bragging, right? Somebody who brags, right? A braggart would be somebody expressing too much pride. So there's a lot. We have a lot of words, and none of those things are appealing, right? They're not appealing. Such a person could take pride in themselves and be happy and be socially, a very convivial person. But notice that people who are arrogant or egotistical or cocky or braggarts, they're not people we enjoy hanging around with either, usually. So these vices have social components to them as well as personal components. And the Greeks had a word for too much pride, arrogant pride in Greek, which we have in English. We have this word called hubris, and that's the Greek word for an excess of pride. Okay. So back to the main point, that pride is not a virtue in every culture. What there's a religion, a very major religion, in which pride is what? Sin. Surely some of you may know this, or were in fact brought up in a religion where you were taught that if you felt proud of something that you did, then you should confess it. Isn't it the case? Yes, absolutely, Mame. And not only Catholicism, in a lot of Christians, Catholicism is a big one, the most numerous adherents, but in many sects of Christianity, particularly, pride is a sin, right? A sin. Pride is an offense against God, because we are very small compared to God. We are nothing compared to God. And it's God who gives us these abilities. I'm giving you the justification for that as being sinful, that by making ourselves proud, we're trying to elevate ourselves above the human station. We're trying to make ourselves into little gods, or into being something which is, not recognizing that we should be humbling ourselves before God. So the virtue certainly in the Christian faith, and I think in the Judeo-Christian faith, and possibly in Islam too, correct me if I'm mistaken, is humility before God. That we're supposed to humble ourselves before God, and not express our pride before God. So pride would be a sin, and actually humility is the virtue. Humility is the virtue that would be practiced, and not enough humility would be called pride. And too much humility might be an extreme form of self-abnegation, which is like going beyond that, and being guilty for everything, which some people suffer from too. But basically, just understand this is an example. I'm trying to give you a very clear example of how something that could be considered virtuous in a particular culture could also be considered to be a vice in a different culture. You see? You see what I'm driving at? In general, do you get the point? Yeah, of course. Good. So that means that it would be very difficult for us. In principle, it might be impossible for us to come up with a list of virtues that everybody would agree with. Because if different things are virtues in different cultures, then we can't come up with a list of universal virtues. Now, the United Nations has tried to do this. The so-called Millennium Development Goals, and now the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, they're called SDGs. SDGs from the UN. Okay, they're called sustainable. They were called Millennium Development Goals that were supposed to have been attained by 2015. Some of them were, and some of them weren't. So they changed them. They reworked them, and now they're called Sustainable Development Goals. And this is the new project. There's a big list, maybe a dozen or so. Now these are attempts at kind of global virtues that every nation, would want to adopt as salutary outcomes and would want to strive toward. So that's a question. You want to look at them and ask yourself the same question. Is it really true that every culture, every political system, every religion on the planet all subscribe to those same SDGs? I don't think so. To be the role of a skeptic this morning, not necessarily, although many of them may be praiseworthy. It's a separate question as to whether they're all universally adoptable as virtues. If we're going to allow freedom of religion and freedom of cultural autonomy and freedom of personal autonomy, then if we have that freedom, then arguably there'd be a contradiction if we start to impose one set of virtues on everybody, right? You see the conflict in that? Sure. So this is a very good example of one, I think, one very clear example of why universal ethics may fail. If you want to have the freedom of worshiping as you see fit, or of running, or belonging to a political party that has values that you see as those worthy of espousing, and if you want to have all those freedoms, then are we not acknowledging that different people will think of different things as being virtuous? And so how can we impose one set of virtues on anybody without depriving some people of their freedom of choice? So that immediately is a big ethical dilemma, becomes also a political dilemma. All right. I'm not saying that philosophers have the answers. We don't. But I'm pointing out to you that we certainly have the questions, and this is a question we can ask. Can we come up with a set of virtues such that everybody would agree to think of them as virtues? If so, we could solve that problem. All right. Okay. Well, thank you for being on the ball this morning, and I'm happy you're obviously getting this point. And so, I mean, I think virtue ethics are great, but I'm also pointing out to you that it would be very difficult to have one universal set of virtues that everybody might subscribe to. Okay, I'm just saying that. And so that would be therefore a weakness of virtue ethics. Again, every system we're going to study will have a different strength and a different weakness. And maybe at the end of the day, you think, if you're a utopian or an idealist or an optimist, you might think, well, why can't we take just the strengths? Why can't we make a system of ethics that takes the strengths only from each of these systems and then, retains all the strengths and none of the weaknesses? No one's ever been able to do that. If you can do that, maybe you'll win a Nobel Peace Prize. Who knows? But meanwhile, I wanted to make these points to you about Aristotle. All right, any questions about any of this? If you have some, please. Otherwise, we'll go to the slideshow. All right. Everyone's clear? Very well. Thank you, Mame. Everyone else is clear so far? Okay. So remember, I mentioned on Monday, and I'll reiterate that the Greeks thought that geometry was very important. Plato himself said that people should not study politics and ethics until they've had at least 10 years of geometry, because it would give us a grounding in a highly rational, highly deductive way of thinking, and that would give us a foundation for being able to tackle much more difficult problems, such as ethical and political. They recognize that ethical and political problems were going to give rise to disputes and differences of opinion and differences of value, whereas everybody could agree on geometry. So they thought, if everybody can agree on geometry, maybe if we spent more time studying geometry, then we could extend, the things in geometry that make everybody agree, and then extend them somehow to politics and ethics and get better agreement on those much more difficult subjects. So that was part of it. But there's also this aesthetic pleasure the Greeks took in geometry. Their art and their architecture is famous for this. And you can, if you go to Greece, you'll see the beautiful remnants of the architecture. It's all beautifully proportioned. And that's the link. I mentioned this on Monday, and we'll see it in pictures in a moment. That remember, the root of ethics and aesthetics is axiology, right? Ethics is what we consider to be correct behavior, or correct guiding principles for behavior. Aesthetics is what makes a work of art beautiful or valuable or esteemed. And the root is axiology, or the theory of values themselves. When we talk about a good book or we talk about a good deed, we're using that word good in two related contexts. There's something that makes art good. There's something that makes deeds good. What that root of goodness is the thing that the Greeks grounded in geometry. So let me show you this to start with. I'll try and share a screen with you now so that we can look at how this ties in directly into Aristotle's theory, and also how it informs his virtue ethics, what we call the ethics of the golden mean. Yeah. Well, the golden mean is a geometric object. And that's what we're going to look at right now, as long as I can pull it up. And it looks like I'm in luck this morning. Okay, so everybody can see this screen, right? Hopefully. And this is the ABCs of virtue ethics. It turns out that Aristotle is not the only virtue ethicist of antiquity. The Greeks were almost all virtue ethicists, one way or the other. But there were other cultures with which Aristotle was not in contact that were also virtue ethicists. At the root of them were actually virtue ethicists. It turns out that fortuitously in Indo-European languages, we could look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius as the actual ABCs of virtue ethics. Buddha, I'm talking now about Buddha as a philosopher, not as a religion. I know Buddhism is a huge religion in Asia, but Buddha can also be understood as a philosopher, since Buddhism is very peculiar. One of the peculiar, I mean by peculiar, I mean it's a religion without a god. Most religions that we think of the Abrahamic faith, they have God running the show. In Hinduism, God's running the show, or more than one God. But Buddhism has no God and no soul, but it's still a religion, so it's a bit curious. And it's very ethics driven, and it's virtue ethics driven, so we can look at that. And Confucius, which is not a religion, but again, like Aristotle, a secular system of ethics that has been very influential to this day in East Asia, meaning primarily in China, Korea, and Japan. You will find what we call Confucian cultures. Maybe some of you are from Confucian cultures, so you know this, that you were brought up. They're still teaching the Analects of Confucius, and students still memorize them because he was transmitting virtues that he considered to be essential to the stability of a political culture and to the maintenance of family and society and polity all the way through. And indeed, these two ancient civilizations, much older than the West, Buddhism comes from Indian civilization, and Confucianism obviously is from Chinese civilization. And India and China are two of the largest and also two of the oldest civilizations on the planet. And for many, many centuries, millennia, they've been partly glued together by the virtue ethics that come from these systems. So you could say that Confucius is the Aristotle of East Asia. But given that Buddha and Confucius lived 200 years before Aristotle, you could also say that Aristotle is the Confucius of the West. And they all subscribed to exactly what Aristotle himself was teaching with the golden mean. This is what might surprise you, okay? I mean, I hope it does. I'll just go to the next slide. They all subscribed to a similar thing, and they gave different names to it. Aristotle is subscribing to the golden mean, and that's what I'm going to explain to you in some detail this morning using geometry. Confucius subscribed to a balanced order. You've seen the yin-yang symbol that comes out of it, but this is also a very harmonious and well-balanced figure in geometry, which represents Confucianism. It represents Tao, and Confucius was trying to implement Tao ethically. Balance, following the way. And Buddha's literally, his system is called the middle way. And it's actually a combination. I'm arguing that it's a combination of the golden mean, which applies mostly to individuals and gives individuals priority over groups. Confucius is the other way around. It gives groups priority, appeals to group harmony, and gives groups priority over individuals. And Buddha's virtue ethics actually takes the best of both. It says it's not either or. Individuals are supremely important and groups are supremely important. So it's more concerned with balancing the interactions between the individual and the group. So you have three different things. But look at what they said. I'm now quoting the core sentence from each one that summarizes their virtue ethics. From Aristotle, we've already seen this, right? We just looked at this on Monday. Moral excellence is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, right? That's his definition of virtue and therefore of moral excellence, right? That's from the text we're studying. Well, look at Buddha's very famous sermon at Benares. I'm quoting now from that. And he said, avoiding these two extremes, overindulgence and asceticism. Overindulgence means excess, and asceticism means denial. Okay? Avoiding these two extremes, the awakened one gains the serendipity of the middle way. And this is really congruent. It's much more complicated than Aristotle's system, but it's absolutely congruent with it, right? Avoiding the two extremes and pursuing the middle way is the path to peace, inner peace, and also the path to moral excellence and to, therefore, eudaimonia. And Confucius, a little more succinctly, a little more concisely, directly from his Analects, he says to go beyond is as wrong as to fall short, right? Too much, not good. Too little, not good. We want, again, to find that middle path, right? The right amount, not too much, not too little. Isn't that already incredible that these three who didn't know each other, again, these two were contemporaries, more or less, but did not know each other at all. They never met. They never knew of each other's work. Impossible at that time for them to know. And Aristotle came a couple of centuries later, and he was not aware of Buddha or Confucius either. And yet they all came to this, what I'm calling really the same conclusion about virtue, that it's in the middle. Okay? Is that cool? Did anybody know this before? Was anyone aware of this previously? Let me see what you're saying. You didn't know this. Good. I'm glad. I think it's really important. It's really important for us to know that these three great civilizations of the ancient world, namely the Chinese civilization, Buddhist civilization, the civilization of India, from which Buddha's philosophy came, and the Greeks, from which our democracy comes, that they were all reaching these three great sages of antiquity had all reached the same conclusion. That's interesting, yeah? So today we're going to focus on Aristotle and see specifically what he has to say. I've given treatments. I've written a book about this, but that's a more complicated story. In any case, here's what Aristotle has to say. We'll go back to the slide. So Aristotle's golden mean, then, is cultivating excellence of mind and body. Remember, he's focusing on your mental health as well as your physical, right? He's talking about exercise and diet and all that. That's for the body. But excellence of the mind is the ethics. But he also innovated in science too. Aristotle wrote, really, he invented the curriculum of the modern university. I think you need to realize most of the subjects we study today, which are being specialized and concentrated in departments such as philosophy, such as politics, such as economics, biology, physics, these departments. Aristotle wrote a book on each one of them. He virtually invented the curriculum of the modern university. That's a Rembrandt, by the way, very low quality resolution of a Rembrandt painting of Aristotle. And Aristotle, again, is all about the fulfillment of inner potential. Because if you are in fact following the golden mean, says Aristotle, you're going to achieve not only the happiness that comes from an ethical life, but you're also going to be able to develop whatever other excellences you may have. If you happen to be intellectually inclined, that will help you to do studies. If you happen to be athletically inclined, it will help you to be successful as an athlete. If you're musically inclined, it will help you to play your instrument better and so forth. So it's all about your inner potential. And so Aristotle's emphasis is on the individual. He's focusing on what each of us has to do in order to achieve that kind of eudaimonia. And he assumes that if a successful majority achieves eudaimonia, then society will in fact be harmonious and just. And that's different from Confucius, but that's the Greek view here. The individual is really important. And that's why the Aristotelian tradition includes things like university curricula, which he very largely invented. Nobel Prizes, that's celebrating individuals, right? Individual accomplishment in many different areas. Olympic medals, ditto, celebrating incredible individual accomplishment at very diverse kinds of sports, yes? And individual excellences of all kinds. This is really the Aristotelian picture. And in truth, he says, if you read his book in more detail, he really believes that you need to discover and develop your individual excellence, and that each of us has. Each of you has some excellence. And if you are able to develop that excellence in a virtuous pathway, then indeed you will become fulfilled. That's a very optimistic and a very empowering, very encouraging view. And so this is what we inherit from him: Nobel Prizes, athletic accomplishments, musical, teamwork, but everyone's mastering their own instrument. You can't get on a stage and play others until you develop your own excellence at your own instrument, right? So that's the kind of picture that comes from Aristotle. I took this photo in Madrid. This is a motto outside the Royal Academy of Music in downtown Madrid. Okay, and what does it say? It's Latin, nulla ethica sine aesthetica. Does anybody know what it means? Because if Spanish, you already know what it means. Nobody knows? Okay, it means no ethics without aesthetics. This is an academy of music, which is focused on aesthetics, right? Music is an aesthetic endeavor, but they're also recognizing this connection between ethics and aesthetics, right? That they both involve this kind of balance and this kind of proportion. And they're saying something stronger. They're saying you couldn't even be ethical unless you had aesthetic sensibilities. It's a very interesting connection. I'm just saying this is a contemporary building. If you go to Madrid, I promise, go downtown, you'll see it. Okay, so that's a modern depiction of an ancient connection. So how does Aristotle forge this connection? Let's have a look. It starts with geometry. The common denominator with ethics and aesthetics is geometry, and Aristotle's ethics are called the golden mean because it comes from this object called the golden triangle. So again, to reiterate, good deeds, good hearts, good character, and good citizens, that ethical use of goodness is related to good painting, good architecture, good music, good art. And what relates them is geometry. We don't often think about this in everyday life because we've tended to separate them, but they are conjoined from the theory of values. If we value good deeds and we value good painting, then there is something that is good is functioning as a common denominator in our theory of valuation. Okay, and geometry is explicitly a foundation of that common denominator. And this particular object is called the golden rectangle. And it's called the golden rectangle because it exists in a very unique proportion. There's no other rectangle like it. This quantity phi, Greek letter phi, is what defines the golden rectangle. And it's in a specific proportion such that if you take a unit square, right, unit length, the golden rectangle consists of a unit square and another golden. That the side of that rectangle is phi minus 1. So the actual relation that obtains in the golden rectangle is unique. There's no other rectangle with this proportion. Phi turns out to be equal to 1 over phi minus 1. And that's the algebra. The actual quantity, phi is a non-terminating, non-repeating decimal, but you can get to better and better approximations of it. It's approximately 1.618. I mean, that's just 3 places, okay? But you can get better and better approximations. But this is how it looks. It's a very beautiful, well-proportioned rectangle, excuse me, the golden rectangle. And here's how you can construct it if any of you have a compass and a straight edge at home. By Euclidean methods, you can build it in 5 minutes or less. First, you make a square, A, B, C, D, okay, of unit length, whether it's 1 foot or 1 inch or whatever your unit measure is, doesn't matter. So you construct a square A, B, C, D, okay? Then what you do is you bisect AB. So E is the midpoint of AB, right? And then you draw a line connecting E to C. Okay, you're almost done. Once you draw that line, EC, then you take your compass, and with center E and radius EC, you just mark your compass. Then you draw an arc, and you project AB to F, and where that arc intersects the projection of AB at F, that is phi. You've now constructed phi in a few short steps using only Euclidean methods, which is basically a pencil, a ruler, and a compass. Okay, and you've now constructed phi. Okay, that's what it is. And that's the golden rectangle. Now, it turns out to be an amazing object. First of all, in terms of art and architecture, it has many applications. This is the Parthenon in Athens, and if you look at it more closely, as I've done with superimposing these rectangles, you will see that the proportions, many of the main proportions, and also the sub-proportions of the Parthenon are golden rectangles, and that's not an accident. The Greeks knew about this object, and they used it all over the place in their architecture and their art, because it gives very pleasing proportions. Just pleases the eye, as it turns out, architecturally. If you fast forward to the Italian Renaissance, one of the most important paintings of all time is the Mona Lisa, right? She's deemed to be one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful painting ever painted. Mona Lisa is famous. When things are normal in Paris, you can't even get in to see her. There's one room in the Louvre, right, where she's hanging alone. And I've been in that room. There's usually hundreds of taken pictures of that painting. You can't even get in there to see it. And if you notice something they probably don't know, which I've depicted for you, do you see the yellow rectangle around her face? You see that? Is it visible to you? Yeah? That's a golden rectangle, my friends. And Da Vinci, who was a great, great architect and artist, he knew all about this, and he deliberately proportioned her face so that the oval of her face fits perfectly inside a golden rectangle. And that's one of the reasons why, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why everybody in so many successive generations finds her to be beautiful. She has that pleasing proportion. You can look at the French Impressionists, Mondrian, Monet, and their human figures. They use deliberately. They fit many of their figures inside golden rectangles. And then the stuff that fits in your wallet. Why does it fit so well in your wallet? Because it's close to a golden rectangle. The stuff that doesn't fit well, you have to fold, bend, mutilate, and spindle. That's not a golden rectangle. The stuff that fits easily is in our pockets and in our wallets, usually the golden rectangle shape. So it has all kinds of use, right? All kinds of aesthetic properties and also utility for us. Now, here's something that the Greeks didn't know, and that is even more amazing. It was discovered only in the 12th century by Fibonacci, and Leonardo Fibonacci, who's Italian in origin, was actually in North Africa, which during the time of the Golden Age, here's another golden thing, the Golden Age of the Caliphates, the famous time, roughly 1000 to 1300, when the enlightened caliphates in North Africa and that whole Islamic culture invited Jewish and Christian scholars, and they made incredible with their own scholars, their own Islamic scholars. They translated the Greek classics into Arabic, preserving them for the West during the dark ages of Europe that descended after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Many of you may have studied this, I hope, in World Civ. The Western literary culture was preserved by the Islamic civilization in North Africa, where they translated everything into Arabic. And they also developed mathematics and philosophy to a very high degree at that time. And Fibonacci was born in what today would be Algeria. His father was a civil servant in one of the governments, so he went to school as a child. He was, raised in North Africa, and he studied mathematics there. And he made this contribution named after him, the Fibonacci series. It's one of the most beautiful and astounding things that was a secret that the golden rectangle concealed, and the Greeks never knew because they didn't have algebra. They had geometry, but not algebra. So if you take phi and start expanding it exponentially, right? So phi squared will turn out to be phi plus 1, phi cubed, 2 phi plus 1, etc. You just do if you do the exponential expansions of phi, what you get are, look at these coefficients that fall out of the expansion. And 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, right? And they repeat here. This is called the Fibonacci series, okay? These coefficients, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Now, how you get the series is you say each term in the series is the sum of the previous two terms. So 1 plus 1 are 2. 1 plus 2, 3. You get it? 2 plus 3, 5. 5, right? 3 plus 5, 8. 8 plus 5, 13. So everybody with this? So that's how you generate the series. You just keep summing the previous terms, and you get the next term. So what's important about that? Well, let me show you. The series is amazing for a number of reasons. And one of them is that, as I say, it's buried in the golden rectangle itself. Because the golden rectangle always has this amazing property that every golden rectangle can be decomposed into a square and a smaller golden rectangle, right? And if you take the smaller golden rectangle that lies within, it can always be decomposed into a square and a smaller golden rectangle. And then that golden rectangle could be decomposed into a square and a smaller one. This is not perfectly to scale, but those are the numbers. So what you get is the Fibonacci series via geometry. You could actually start with a unit square and a unit square, and that would give you a 2 by 1 square, a 2 by 1 rectangle. Then if you make the square on top of that, which you can do in 2 minutes with Euclidean tools, then you get an approximation of a golden rectangle, but not a very good one. If you then complete that figure, you get a better approximation. Then you have a square of side 5, which you add, you get a better approximation, and now a better and a better. And the more times you do this, the closer you'll get to the actual value of phi. Okay? So basically, this series, if you want it in modern terminology, those of you who are taking calculus, we would say this series, the ratio of successive terms converges uniformly on phi. So the Greeks did not know this, okay? They knew that the golden rectangle was always decomposable into a square and another golden rectangle, but they did not know the Fibonacci series, which was discovered only by him, again, in the late 12th century. So that's quite a jump to discovering this thing. And here's the amazing part. I think it gets more amazing. That's just amazing mathematically. This is what gets really interesting, is so-called Fibonacci spiral. If you then construct that, ever-increasing approximation by adding the successive squares, what happens is if you then join the vertices in this pattern, you're going to end up with a spiral, and that's called the Fibonacci spiral. Now, what is amazing about that? Take a look. This thing is everywhere in nature. Once you know how it looks, you will be able to spot it all over the place. There it is in a very common shell that you'll find on beaches all over the world, a nautilus shell. That spiral is a Fibonacci spiral. Very good approximation, right? I mean, if you're doing curve fitting, you would say that's a pretty good approximation. So nature knows this thing in some way. What about a large object? Well, how about spiral galaxy M100? 2 Fibonacci spirals orbiting around each other, which is this is a galactic object. This is an enormous object. But if you look at the 2 spiral arms, you will see, once again, that they are very good approximations of a Fibonacci spiral on a cosmic scale. So we have very small, very big. It's in vegetables too. If you look at a cauliflower head on, you look down the cauliflower, you'll see these whorl patterns, right? You see the swirling pattern of the buds, and many vegetables and flowers have this whorl, W-H-O-R-L. That's a Fibonacci spiral. You'll see it in your shrimp cocktail too. Okay. So you get this curve all over the place. And so it's an object that obviously nature loves. And Aristotle would say this is a form which nature loves. He didn't know about the spiral, but he knew about forms. And we would say this is an incredible form that appears on every scale, from extremely large to relatively small. For all I know, there are even smaller things that conform to this. Okay? And not only this, but one more thing. The numbers themselves, you remember the numbers 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, right? Those numbers also pop up all over the place in branching structures. Wherever nature branches, very often, not always, but very often, it uses Fibonacci numbers. So we have, for example, 5 digits, right? Normally, four fingers and a thumb. 5 digits is a Fibonacci number. We have two legs normally, 2 arms, Fibonacci numbers, 2 nostrils, 2 eyes, 2 ears, Fibonacci numbers, 1 tongue, 1 mouth, Fibonacci numbers. Flowers very often have the number of petals on the flower is going to be a Fibonacci number more often than not. That's why you don't find 4-leaf clovers, right? Everyone's always looking for a 4-leaf clover. Why is that? 4 is not a Fibonacci number. And so clovers, from whatever reason, often have 3 or 5 petals, but very rarely 4. If you have nothing to do whatsoever and you want to start counting the forks on lightning or branches on trees, you'll also discover that branching structures very often will use Fibonacci numbers too. And of course, we have a whole family of arachnids, 8-legged creatures, right? Be they cephalopods, like I think that's what octopi are, and squids. There's 8 legs, right? Fibonacci number. And spiders, 8 legs. 8 legs. Very successful species, even if you're horrified by them. Some people are afraid of spiders. 8 legs, right? Fibonacci number. Fibonacci number. And here's the bottom line, and this is the connection with aesthetics. This page comes from, comes from Berkeley University Psychology Department. And I've given you the link there so you can follow it. You'll find that on that page, okay? Geometry of beauty. And these are psychologists, they haven't necessarily studied Aristotle's ethics, but they have studied aesthetics. Standards of beauty may be related to natural mathematical proportions, which have captivated humans across cultures since the beginning of time, such as the golden ratio. And this is a statement by very good psychologists at a very good university who are recognizing that what we call beautiful is an aesthetic judgment, but in the end, something about what we call beautiful has to do with what? It has to do with proportion. And therefore, it may be related, and I would say definitely is related, to mathematical proportions, such as the golden ratio. And we're not seeing the golden ratio here, but we're seeing proportionality. And it's nothing to do with age or gender or race or ethnicity, or it has to do with proportion. Proportion. I can tell you that some experiments done with infants, where infants were shown 2 sequences of slides of faces, of human faces. Infants look at human faces, right? Infants will look. There's not much they can do when they're newborn, but they'll look at human faces. And they were shown 2 simultaneous sequences of slides of human faces, some which are very well proportioned and others which were less well proportioned. And by measuring the amount of time the infants spent on eye contact, the result was overwhelmingly that the infants spent more time looking at the so-called well-proportioned faces. And so think about it in another sense. If people who, let's say, opt for what we call cosmetic surgery, they want to tweak something, right? If you opt for cosmetic surgery, usually you want to make something a little bigger, something a little smaller, correct? And what's that all about? That's about proportion. Yeah, it's about changing the proportions to make them more supposedly beautiful. So I think there's all kinds of threads of evidence that would show you that when we talk about beauty, very often we're talking, whether it's architecture or whether it's music or whether it's a human form, we're really very often talking about proportion. And therefore, there's some mathematical basis to it. And of course, Aristotle would claim that that's exactly the same basis for our ethics. Oh, Erkin, is that why babies cry every time they look at me? Oh dear, I don't know, Erkin. I don't know. Maybe you should conduct an experiment and put on a mask of a. Well, maybe I don't know. That's very funny. I'm not so sure. Maybe there's a different reason. Maybe it could be the vibe. I can't. I mean, I haven't seen you. I don't know what you look like, but basically, that's sort of. I think you're joking, right? Okay. Yeah, it must be the vibe because babies are also very sensitive to emotions. Maybe the vibe. But in any case, back to Aristotle. I hope it's clear. I hope this much is clear that Aristotle is telling us not only that ethics can be practiced via this theory of the golden mean, but that it reposes on geometry. And so the very things that the Greeks wanted to turn out, namely well-proportioned citizens in terms of our conduct, right? So you see the linkage again is being forged between ethics and aesthetics, because we would say, well, we want to hire architects who build well-proportioned buildings, which are pleasing to look at. We want to hire sculptors who sculpt well-proportioned objects of art, painters who paint well-proportioned portraits and so forth, or paintings, and that's something that we find beautiful. And there may be deep, evolutionary reasons. There may be something in our biology and in our brain which actually allows us to recognize proportion and to want to celebrate it in some way and call it good aesthetically. But Aristotle is saying, and this is the vital linkage, and he got it from Plato. Next week we're going to look at his teacher, right? And Aristotle is saying, yeah, but we also want well-proportioned citizens, and not in terms of their physicality, but in terms of their deeds, in terms of their actions, and how we behave toward one another, society, and that would be ethics. So we would very much like to have a kind of well-proportioned dimension of ethics. As we value well-proportioned aesthetics, we want to value well-proportioned ethics, and so that's going to be geometry again. And that's where his golden mean comes from. It's really derived from the golden rectangle. But remember one thing, that whereas with geometric constructions, they're all very precise, like he says, if you're going to bisect an angle or construct a rectangle of a certain proportion, we're all going to do it the same way if the geometric constructions are clear, because that's precise art. What we eat, what we drink, how much we exercise and so forth, this is up to each of us, right? To find the mean with regard to health is to find the mean relative to us, not relative to some absolute number. And similarly, therefore, in our ethics, the balance we find in our virtues is going to be a little bit relative to us too. So not everyone will have exactly the same amount of courage, exactly the same amount of pride, or exactly the same amount of wisdom. But relative to us, it's going to be a mean, each of us. So is that helpful to give you a bigger picture? This kind of gives you a really, and I wanted to give you this very important big context, so the Nicomachean Ethics doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of the Greeks' appreciation of the importance of geometry, both for art and for ethics, and ultimately for politics, because therefore a society of people who are well proportioned in their conduct, says Aristotle, would be a society that would also be harmonious and therefore also relatively just. Okay? Not utopia, because there's no perfection in art and there's no perfection in ethics. The Greeks weren't utopians by any means. Democracy is not a utopia, but it's a place where one hopefully reaches a proportion. Okay? Any questions about this? We're sort of done for now with Aristotle, and I'm willing to entertain any questions arising from today. And then after class, which ends in a couple of minutes, I'll stay with you, Sarah, and I'll stay with anyone else who has specific questions about your essay, which is due Monday, right? Please don't neglect that. Blackboard is enabled. Please upload it there. I'll look forward to reading them. And any questions about today? All right, fair enough. So we're going to leave Aristotle there, and you're going to work on your essays, presumably this weekend. I'm sure many of you will be busy. Please get them in by midnight Monday. And also, next week, a heads up, we'll be reading Plato and some extracts from the Republic, not the whole book. It's a huge book. but we're going to look at the allegory of the cave and the myth of Gyges' ring, and a few really interesting extracts which will give us a sense of Plato's theory of good, which is very different from Aristotle, and Plato's theory of virtue. Plato was a virtue ethicist, but unlike Aristotle, he believed that virtues are innate and have to be cultivated. He thought we were all born virtuous, but we don't know it. So we have to get in touch with our virtues. That's very different from Aristotle's theory, okay? So I hope you have a busy and productive weekend. I wish you all a very good one, and also a very fulfilled and happy one in the Aristotelian sense, okay? Be flourishing beings. And bye, and we'll see you. I look forward to seeing you Monday morning, all right? In the plenary, and certainly Thursday. But next week we're looking at Plato, very major philosopher and Aristotle's teacher for many years. Okay, everybody, those who want to stick around for specific essay related questions, please do so. I'm going to stop the recording now and sign off and wish you all again a very happy weekend. All right, bye for now.